A year into their first term, President Biden and Vice President Harris's approval numbers are much lower than when they started. In his victory speech when he won the presidency, Mr. Biden promised to unify the country. And at his inauguration 1 year ago today, he railed against how divided the U.S. had become.
Politics doesn't have to be a raging fire, destroying everything in its path. Every disagreement doesn't have to be a cause for total war.
But a year later, some of the key initiatives on the president's agenda are stalled in Congress, with both parties digging in their heels and not giving an inch. For a look back at the first year of the Biden administration and what lies ahead, I want to bring in Leslie Sanchez. She's a CBS News political analyst and a Republican strategist, and Joel Payne. He's a CBS News political contributor and a Democratic strategist. So, I remember the inauguration speech talking about unity and achieving unity through sort of big, bold actions that would improve people's lives. 1 year into Mr. Biden's presidency, his approval numbers are not the best. A new CBS News poll shows that President Biden and Vice President Harris both have approval ratings of 44%. So when you look at how the Democrats alone are rating them, though, what you see is the approval rating goes up to 81%. Joel, I want to ask you, are you concerned about these numbers? What's your take on them? And do you think they'll have an impact on the midterm elections?
Well, polling is a snapshot, and it kind of reflects where we are right now. But look, those numbers aren't permanent, just like they weren't permanent when they were looking pretty good 8-9 months ago. I think what the president and his team have to focus on is telling a story that lifts the spirits of the American people, because there actually is a good story to tell if they want to. And if their allies in Congress wants to, you can tell a story about working with Republicans to pass a big infrastructure bill, about attacking COVID out the gate, and about some really positive economic indicators to show that the country is overall doing better, even if it's not being experienced by everybody. So there's a story that can be told that way that I think also Joe Biden can sell to Democrats who are running up and down the ballot this next year up into 2022. The problem for the president right now is part psychological, because he's got a party and a base that's really battered, that's not feeling good, particularly after what happened last night with the failed voting rights filibuster reform effort that's been building up over the last few weeks. So the president's got a tough job right now. He's got time to do it, but he's got to get the spine of the Democratic Party bucked up a bit.
Leslie, I want to get your take on some interesting data that I saw this morning from the Center for American Progress, which I know is left of center, but the data is what it is. And it shows that 48 of the 48 senators who voted to reform the filibuster, they represent 182 million Americans, which is 55% roughly of the United States. The 52 senators who upheld the filibuster represent 148 million Americans, which is about 45% of the population of this country. So the 48 Democrats who supported reforming the filibuster to try to get voting rights passed represent 34 million more Americans than those 52. Now, I know somebody might say, well, if you take out, New York and California and Illinois, but you could do the same if you take out, for the Republicans, if you take out Florida, North Carolina, and Texas. But what does that say to you about where we are, specifically as it relates to the Senate and getting anything done? And Joel, I want your take on this too.
Vlad, I think it's interesting. It's an interesting comparison. And I think you're exactly on point when you're saying, let's take out California and New York. And the reason we would say that is there's tremendous bi-coastal liberalism in those very blue states that overweight because of the size and density of those states, that skew the data when you look at kind of the flyover states, right? And I would not, by contrast, take out a Florida, a North Carolina, any of those areas, or a Texas, because they are increasingly battleground states because of the dynamic, the change, the demographics, and a lot of political reasons. So I think the data coming from a left of center organization is skewed. It's trying to paint a picture. But the bigger question is, where does the Senate go? Is there room for compromise? Do we want to change the filibuster rules so that we can have simple majorities on major legislation? And I think going back to the founding fathers and how they established the cooling mechanism and the mechanisms in place in the Senate is for exactly this reason: the risk and the concern about such polarized environments that could sway really dramatic legislation in voting rights, particularly where Republicans see that as a nationalizing and federalizing statewide elections, and those are authorities that are specifically given to states. So I think that to say that it's a political message that was pushed forward, and with respect to where it is, this is where the Senate should be. And I felt, just to cap all this off, the president talking about his surprise at the lack of support, or kind of the obstructionist nature of the Republicans is really just a false argument. For someone who'd been in the Senate for so long, he understands that this is exactly what the Senate's for. And I think you're going to continue to see a need for bipartisan support to get that major legislation forward.
Joe, what's your take on those numbers?
You know, Vlad, as I love the thought exercise, and I think it's super interesting. And I think Leslie gave a very good, cogent answer that I think I probably agree with about just how you can break it down. But look, I'm a political strategist. I think that that's a poor excuse for most Democrats to lean on, right? Talking about the unfairness of the Senate. Like, the Senate's been unfair for a long time. I worked in the Senate when Democrats had 60 votes and you passed big things. And guess what? You lost in a midterm. These things happen. It's cyclical. I think what's frustrating to most Democrats right now is the fact that you've got a slim majority, but you don't have kind of a uniform, unanimous will among that majority to do the work that they were sent there to do, particularly on voting rights. When you have a solution in hand, and I know people are going to bring up the filibuster and say, well, historically, we protect the filibuster. Well, actually, we don't. The filibuster's changed a lot, particularly in the 60s and the 70s. It's not something, as Senator Manchin has said, that goes back to our founders. Our founders really didn't conceive of a filibuster, particularly the way it's used as a bludgeon right now. So I think what Democrats have to do is garner up the unanimous combined will to do the work that they were sent there to do, figure out a way to do something on voting rights that's meaningful, figure out a way to get the president's agenda passed through Build Back Better, even if it's broken up, and then sell it to the American people and stop buffering and stalling on process.
So let's talk about the pandemic that sort of hovers over everything, all aspects of life now. Back in 2020, President Biden campaigned on ending the pandemic. I want to play some sound from a debate in October of 2020.
What I would do is make sure we have everyone encouraged to wear a mask all the time. I would make sure we move in the direction of rapid testing, investing in rapid testing. I would make sure that we set up national standards as to how to open up schools and open up businesses so they can be safe, and give them the wherewithal, the financial resources to be able to do that. I will take care of this. I will end this. I will make sure we have a plan.
So you remember after President Biden's first 100 days, there was a sort of a lot of applause about ramping up of vaccines. And then there was some questioning as to whether or not, the Biden administration set the bar low so they could exceed it quite easily. And now here we are today. A recent CBS News poll found that 64% of Americans think that the country's fight against COVID-19 is actually going badly. The Omicron variant, I'm sure, had a lot to do with it, and whether or not the administration was prepared for it. And, perhaps we're past the time where you can blame the missteps of the previous administration. Leslie, what do you think is driving these numbers, and what do you think the president has to do to turn this around?
So for the president to claim victory so early on in the administration got a lot of people feeling very comfortable that the president had a very strong grasp on what to do in the global pandemic. And it's proved to be a false promise. That's where the irritation is among not only just Republicans, because that's always been a contentious fight, but for among the moderates or the swing voters that were in the middle who wanted a change of direction. They put a tremendous amount of faith in the president and saw that he failed. Not only did he fail in meeting the objective of increased testing, of an anticipation of how the turn of the pandemic, but the economic impact that a sustained pandemic was going to have on their pocketbooks. All of those measures are connected together. There wasn't an Operation Warp Speed. For people that want to push back against the previous administration, there was an understanding, there was a rapid response to these things. You didn't have that. You had the president come in, okay, wipe his hands. We've changed so many times on the types of masks, on the types of protocols, and now they're disagreeing and just in our local classrooms. So it's a really far cry to think the president has a command of this issue and how it's impacting the country. And that increasingly is the uptick on his disapproval.
Something else, Joel, that people have cited as the reason why some Americans are disappointed in President Biden is the military exit from Afghanistan. And Joel, you've actually said that this moment started the, quote, Biden slide. I want to get your take on that. And I was thinking of something, Joel, when I was sort of looking at your research and things that you've written and spoken about, which is when we were kids, we all remember the Marine barracks attack in Beirut that happened during President Reagan, I believe during his first term. And here's the headline from the New York Times back then. Reagan asserts blame in his Marine security failure, opposes punishing officers. And I just thought to myself, what has changed with the way that we as citizens of this country react to news like that? That attack in the barracks was horrific and horrible. What happened in Afghanistan was horrific and horrible. But the way that we talk about what happened in Afghanistan is very different. And I wonder, Joel, maybe Leslie too, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What has changed? Where we used to all rally behind the president of the United States, no matter what party he was, to support whatever he decided to do in the wake of tragedy, we now don't really seem to do that. What do you think is the deal?
Vlad, I could literally spend 20 minutes talking about this because I think this is so fascinating. It's where the country writ large has gone, which is a breakdown in trust in institutions. It's the institution that we're communicating on right now, media, trust is down, military, government, education, the church, all institutions, trust is down across the board. And we are not in a place where people are led to believe in the things that they grew up believing in. You don't believe inherently that the church or government or media is good and is pursuing, positive outcomes for you in your life because you've had so many opportunities where they could have stood up and stood to the test of time and they missed the moment. And I think when you're talking about what happened with President Biden in Afghanistan, he was elected under the precipice that he could restore faith and favor in the country and that he could do the job, right? He is competent. He's able to do the job of president on day one. And I think that broke a lot of trust with the president. And I think that's led to other trust issues with this president. Really quickly, Leslie talked about COVID. And I think a thing that we always have to remember is COVID already took down one president. That's why Joe Biden's the president. Donald Trump lost the presidency because of COVID. It's the thing that you can't defeat at the ballot box. And if the Biden folks aren't able to wrap their arms around this, it's going to take down a second presidency.
Leslie, real quick, I know we got to run, but I really want to hear your thoughts on that. Is it what Joel was saying, the breakdown in trust in our institutions and also the rise of partisan media? Let's frankly be clear about that.
I'm so glad you said that, Vlad. It's two things. I completely agree with so much of what Joel said. He's absolutely on point there. The disagreement I have is that Donald Trump took down Donald Trump, and many Republicans, half the country, would certainly agree with that. But 2 points. Yes, failures in faith in public and private institutions, but a lot of that started, Vlad, in 2008 with the economic downturn of this country. It was a long and deep one. People lost their pensions, people lost their retirement savings, they lost their homes, and they took 10 years plus to recover from that. And many feel that they never have. And to see inflation at a 40-year high, to see this ongoing pandemic with no relief in sight, this is really scaring a lot of Americans. And that's why you're seeing that and this hyper-partisan media. We went from a 24-hour news cycle to a 2 to 4 second tweet cycle. That changed how we interpret this data. And that's the ride and the polarization we're on for the foreseeable future.